Among all the well-known and notorious former members of the Manson family, there are also a few that remain a mystery. Some were there just so brief, they came and they left without paying the consequences that others did. And one member is perhaps less of a mystery than some would like to have you believe. The truth is, not everyone who passed through this group of people was a killer. Not everyone subscribed to Manson's apocalyptic teachings or lived by his twisted philosophies. Some were drawn in by the music, the promise of freedom, or simply the gravitational pull of the era itself. They drifted through the family's orbit like so many others who found themselves lost in the cultural chaos of the late 1960s, hungry for meaning, connection, or a place to belong. Many of them drifted away again and returned to their lives without ever telling us their stories. That's the challenge in telling this tale, because in the mix of those who stayed and those who fled, those who followed and those who resisted, we're left with fragments, known facts, presumed beliefs, and vast unknowns. The lines blur between loyalty and fear, between complicity and survival, and emptiness. Decades later, the story still feels like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, some hidden by time, others intentionally withheld. Those mysteries only add to the sense that the later murders have a wider scope than we've been told. And it's within those gaps between what we know and what we think we know that the real mystery of the Manson family endures. Today, we'll try to explore how easily some family members slipped back into the world anonymous, while the rest of the family's story calcified into legend. Bruce Van Hall, aka John Hall, aka New Bruce, aka Bruce Bluestein. Born February 10th, 1946 in Louisiana. Bruce Van Hall is one of those Manson era figures who appears briefly, leaves a couple of fingerprints in the historical record, and then slips out of view. In an odd way, the clearest picture we have of him comes from the very beginning of his life. A newspaper photo from September 1947, where baby Bruce won a local beautiful baby contest in Bauchamville, Louisiana. At the time, he and his mother were living with his grandmother, Mrs. Amos Krebs, while his father, Lieutenant Edward I. Hall, was stationed at the Boca Raton Army Airfield during and after World War II. It's one of the few solid early life details we have about him. After that, the trail goes quiet until Bruce resurfaces on the West Coast in the late 1960s. By early 1968, he was drifting through the Los Angeles counterculture, one of many young men who intersected with the early Manson circle long before the group became infamous. Bruce enters the family's orbit in February 1968, when Susan Atkins leaves Topanga with him for several weeks. Susan returned pregnant, and for a short time there was speculation that Bruce might be the father. Atkins later explained that the pregnancy happened after she and Bruce separated with a drifter named Michael Wine. Regardless of who fathered the child, Bruce was back in Topanga with the group by the time they reunited at the Summit Trail cabin. Once Bruce was living among them, a different role emerged. He agreed to pretend to be the husband of 14-year-old Diane Lake if police questioned them. Diane later explained that passing as a married minor was the only thing protecting her from being flagged as a runaway and detained. Bruce adopted the name John Hall, or occasionally Bruce Bluestein for this purpose, which is why Diane appears as Diana Bluestein on the Topanga arrest paperwork. That arrest is one of two that place Bruce firmly with the group in early 68. The first came on April 21st of 68, during the 9 nude hippies incident near Oxnard, when deputies found the group, Bruce included, naked by their broken down bus. Everyone was detained. Mary Bruner was cited for indecent exposure. The rest were released. The second was more serious. On May 2nd, deputies raided the Summit Trail house after reports of runaways and narcotics. Inside, Bruce was sitting in a chair that happened to contain marijuana, seeds, capsules resembling Nembutal, and several driver's licenses. He was arrested with Charles Manson, Sandra Good, Louis Covell, Robert Earl Murray, Bruce Davis, and Diane Lake. With Bruce Davis now in the mix as well, the women began separating the two by calling Bruce Davis Old Bruce and Bruce Van Hall New Bruce. After the May raid, Bruce simply disappears from the historical record. No confirmed later arrests, no interviews, no trial mentions, no obituary tied to him. His short time with the family is preserved only through a baby photo, a pair of arrest reports, and scattered recollections from the people who were there. Robert Earl Murray, aka Mark Damon, born August 8, 1945, in New York. If Bruce Van Hall is a shadow in the historical record, Robert Earl Murray is a ghost, visible for only a moment, as if caught in a flashbulb before fading again. Murray grew up in Pittsford, New York, outside Rochester. He graduated from Pittsford Central High School in 1965, and both his senior portrait and physical description from his May 1968 arrest confirm we're dealing with the same person. He was tall, 6 foot 6 inches, with brown hair and blue eyes, striking enough that deputies made a note of it. After high school, Murray attended Doane College in Crete, Nebraska. A 1966 yearbook index places him at the same Pittsford address later recorded by law enforcement, confirming at least 1 year of college before he dropped out and eventually headed west. Murray's presence in the Manson circle is confirmed by the May 2, 1968 narcotics raid at the Summit Trail house in Topanga Canyon. He was arrested alongside Charles Manson, Sandra Good, Bruce Van Hall, Louis Covell, Bruce Davis, and Diane Lake. The sheriff's report lists Murray under his real name and home address. He was booked for marijuana possession along with the others, but 4 days later, on May 6, 1968, the Ventura County Deputy DA dropped the charges against him and against Manson, Covell, and Davis. After that, Murray briefly appears in Deemer's known associates list, but no record places him at Spawn Ranch during the August 1969 raid, despite occasional internet claims. His alias, Mark Damon, appears only in certain arrest notations and nowhere else. However, he might be in this group photo, taken in the fall of 1968 in Death Valley. After 68, Murray disappears entirely from public view. No later arrests, no interviews, no verifiable obituary. His name resurfaces only when researchers notice that tall young man in the 1965 Pittsford yearbook and connect him to a brief moment in 1968, after which he walked away and never looked back. Louis Charles Covell, aka A1, born October 16, 1944, in Long Beach, California. Louis Charles Covell is one of the least discussed, but most clearly documented early family associates, a man whose entire connection to the group exists on paper, in police files, but not in interviews, not even one single photograph. Covell appears on Lieutenant Earl Deemer's LAPD list of Manson family members and associates in 1969 as Covell, Louis Charles with the nickname A1. Beyond that, very little personal history is confirmed. Research identified him as a former student of Woodrow Wilson High School in Long Beach, but his face remains one of the many not shown in mugshots. Covell's only fully documented interaction with the family comes from the May 2, 1968 Summit Trail raid, where he was suspect number 5 in the sheriff's report. The raid was triggered by complaints of runaways and narcotics activity. Inside the house, deputies found marijuana, seeds, capsules resembling Nembutal, and several questionable driver's licenses. The people arrested that day were Charles Manson, Sandra Good, Bruce Van Hall, Robert Earl Murray, Bruce Davis, and Diane Lake. All 7 were taken to the Malibu Sheriff's Station, and the case was forwarded to the Santa Monica DA. After that, Covell never reappears in any Manson-related legal records. Like Murray and Van Hall, Covell seems to have been a short-term peripheral associate, someone drawn into the orbit for a brief period, caught up in a single arrest event, and then gone. No photographs, no later public records, no known interviews. Just a name on Deemer's list, a high school identification, and an arrest during the 1968 raid. Bruce McGregor Davis, aka Jack McMillan, aka Mark Rollins Grant, born October 5, 1942 in Monroe, Louisiana. Bruce Davis lived a quiet Southern childhood that masked the turbulence to come. He carried an early wound with him into adulthood, a victimization that would mark him forever. As a boy, he had been molested by an older man. Prior to meeting Charles Manson, he would also be marked by an early brush with the justice system that shaped his emerging worldview. In his early 20s, Davis spent 10 days in jail on a marijuana possession charge, only to have the case dismissed. He later said of that brief incarceration, "I made a decision that I would never expend the energy to support a system that put me in jail like that." Something hardened in him in those 10 days. He walked out with a kind of quiet, simmering resentment toward authority. In many ways, the trajectory of his life can be traced back to both of those moments. Bruce left Louisiana for college in Tennessee, then moved to California in 1962, trying to begin a fresh life. But by the mid-1960s, Davis had dropped out, drifted through the counterculture, and fallen into the loose spiritual currents that were sweeping young seekers from town to town. It was during this wandering period, late 1967, that he first crossed paths with Charles Manson and some of the women. They picked him up while driving the old Volkswagen bus that Manson had acquired from a neighbor of Dean Morehouse. Davis, short and stocky with dark hair and a broad jaw, impressed Manson immediately. They talked about Scientology, and Bruce understood the terminology, the cosmology, the rhetoric. The 2 men talked easily, each sensing in the other some mixture of curiosity, charisma, and dissatisfaction with the world as it was. When they dropped Davis off, Manson and the women told him to look them up again later. This first encounter aligned perfectly with Davis's inner landscape. A man who felt exploited by a system he didn't trust, wounded in ways he wouldn't fully articulate at the time, searching for meaning, discipline, or spiritual authority. Scientology, structured, ritualistic, commanding, held his interest perhaps even more deeply than Manson did at the time. He reconnected with the group in early '68 while they were living in Topanga Canyon. And by late '68, Davis had left the United States altogether, traveling to England to study at the Church of Scientology's European headquarters. But the movement expelled him when they discovered he was using drugs. That decision set the next turn of his life in motion. He returned to Los Angeles on April 25, 1969. Ella Jo Bailey picked him up at the airport and drove him straight to Spawn Ranch, where the group welcomed him back. Davis then made a brief trip to Louisiana at the end of April to collect a small family inheritance. He returned to Spawn Ranch in May. By then, Manson's world had intensified dramatically. More theft, more paranoia, more drugs, more surveillance, and more violence simmering just below the surface. Within weeks, Davis had been elevated into a trusted role. He was placed in charge of stolen credit cards and forged identification, a crucial position inside the family's growing criminal operations. That summer, everything escalated. On July 26, 1969, when Manson sent Bobby Beausoleil to Gary Hinman's house to reclaim money tied to a botched drug transaction. Davis was part of the group that drove Bobby and the women there. Davis gave Bobby the knife that was later used to kill Hinman. He then returned to the house with Manson after Mary Bruner called the ranch in distress. They both arrived while Hinman was struggling with Bobby. Manson slashed Hinman's face with a sword, severing part of his ear, and then left, expecting Bobby to finish the job. Davis left with him, and the next morning, Gary Hinman was murdered. By then, Bruce Davis had moved decisively into Manson's inner circle, not the flamboyant one, but the more subtle, logistical shadow space where quiet men did crucial work. He wasn't Tex Watson, who took center stage, nor was he Bobby, the golden-haired musician. Davis was the efficient one, the one who followed instructions, the one Manson could trust with documents, errands, and secrets. After the Tate LaBianca murders, things unraveled quickly. Police pressure increased. Raids came closer. Manson began preparing for a move back to the desert. In the middle of this chaos, Manson told Bruce to drive Diane Lake and 15-year-old Hugh Rocky Todd, two of the teens, along with stolen goods to the tiny town of Olanche, where Tex Watson and Juan Flynn were hiding. Diane later recalled that the instructions felt like preparation for escape or evacuation, evidence of just how unsteady life around Spawn Ranch had become. The murder of Donald Shorty Shea followed soon after. Although later testimony outlines the event blow by blow, the essential truth is that Manson believed Shorty was informing on them, or at least endangering their tenuous hold on Spawn Ranch. He ordered a group of men, including Tex Watson, Steve Grogan, and Bruce Davis, to intercept Shorty as he drove. They assaulted him in the car, dragged him into a culvert, and killed him through a combination of stabbing, bludgeoning, and slashing. At some point during this process, a second vehicle pulled up, and Charles Manson, Bill Van Sickle, and Larry Giddings got out. We do not know what the participation of those three men, however, were. Bruce Davis was an active participant in the murder of Shorty Shea. He stabbed Shorty once in the shoulder with a bayonet-like knife after refusing to decapitate him at Manson's command. Davis would later describe the moment not as an act of hatred, but one of cowardice, the choice of a man too afraid to defy Manson. I discounted his life, he admitted. I thought my life was worth more than his at that point. Steve Grogan buried the body. The family disposed of Shorty's belongings. Rumors and confessions circulated among the women. And for Davis, another irrevocable line had been crossed. The following months fractured the family into feuding pockets of loyalty and suspicion. When Barbara Hoyt and Sherry Cooper attempted to flee from Death Valley, Manson sent Bruce and Clem to find and kill them. They failed, but the order itself showed how far Davis's role had shifted from logistical support to enforcer. After the chaotic weeks in Death Valley, the collapse of discipline at Barker Ranch, and mounting law enforcement presence led to a raid in early October, resulting in all of the family being arrested. Weeks later, in early November, Bruce Davis and several other family members were staying at a house in Venice Beach. That month, John Haught, aka Zero, died in what police labeled a self-inflicted Russian roulette-style gun wound, although many doubt that conclusion. The gun was found wiped clean, but traces of Davis's prints were later found on it. While not enough to bring charges, the death only deepens suspicions in the Manson research community about Davis's capacity for violence and obedience. Personally, I think it is more likely that Bill Van Sickle killed Zero than Davis did. After the death of Zero, Davis fled the country again, returning to London. On December 1st, 1969, he came back to California and went underground, hiding in Bakersfield for nearly a year while the Tate LaBianca investigation expanded and authorities issued sweeping warrants. Meanwhile, the family kept imploding. In London, Sandy Good's former partner Joel Pugh turned up dead in a hotel room, throat slit, wrists slashed. The scene was declared self-inflicted, though the circumstances leaves room for doubt. But Davis had already departed London hours early, making his involvement impossible unless Pugh had died days before the discovery. Back in the US, Mary Brunner turned herself in and cooperated. She revealed the location of Shorty's car, which police found in Canoga Park. Inside was a palm print belonging to Bruce Davis. Bruce was arrested in Bakersfield on February 24, 1970, for using false identification to buy firearms. Even in custody, the family's chaos continued. A new recruit, Jennifer Leghorn, aka Ginny Gentry, slipped him a tab of LSD during a court hearing. She was arrested, but never charged. Davis was released briefly on March 15th, then married family member Nancy Pittman in April under the alias Mark Rollins Grant, a strategic decision meant to prevent them both from testifying against each other at Bobby Beausoleil's trial. On December 2nd, 1970, Bruce and Nancy turned themselves in. Davis later described the decision as the beginning of his rehabilitation, not a moment of moral clarity, but simply the first time he acknowledged that he could not live as an outlaw anymore. It was, he said, my first good decision in a long time. That next year, Davis was tried alongside Charles Manson and Steve Grogan for the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea. The evidence was overwhelming. Davis was convicted of both murders and sentenced to death. When the California Supreme Court abolished the death penalty the following year in 72, his sentence was commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In prison, Davis began another transformation. He converted to Christianity in 74, becoming the first Manson murderer to publicly embrace a new spiritual identity. In the late 1970s, he corresponded with Susan Atkins about religion until his mother demanded that he end that relationship. During the 70s and 80s, Davis did incur several prison infractions, mostly rule violations that reflected a man still adjusting to institutional life. But in the decades since, his record has been clean. He has taken part in self-help programming, maintained steady work assignments, and stayed away from violence. In 1980, he was transferred to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, where he worked alongside Tex Watson in a prison ministry office. In 85, he married a flight attendant named Beth. The couple later had a daughter before separating. Davis would tell a parole board that fear of his possible release played a role in the dissolution of that marriage. He became known in the system as polite, disciplined, a reader, a man who stayed out of trouble. He presented himself as reflective, remorseful, and spiritually evolved. So why did I include Bruce Davis in this episode, Mystery Men? Because for more than 20 years, one particular mystery has surrounded him. The rumor that he was possibly the Zodiac Killer. This rumor resurfaces periodically like a ghost story, often from people who know just enough to sound confident, but not enough to avoid embarrassing themselves. The truth is that the theory was never credible. It started late, it started sloppy, and it never once intersected with real evidence. But to understand why Bruce Davis's name got dragged into this, we need to trace the rumor back to its roots and identify the small handful of people who decided to link two major American crime stories simply because it made for dramatic storytelling. The earliest traceable origin of the Manson Zodiac theory appears in 1997 with a privately published book by Howard Davis, no relation to Bruce, titled The Zodiac Manson Connection. This book claimed, based on anonymous inside sources, that California law enforcement had secretly connected a Manson associate to the Zodiac murders and covered it up. There was no documentation, no statements from investigators, no forensic claims, just a vague, unsourced allegation designed to merge two infamous stories for shock value. A conspiracy theory was born. But if Howard Davis planted the seed, Bill Nelson fertilized it. Nelson was already notorious in Manson circles by the late 1990s. He wasn't just a hobbyist researcher, he was a man whose fixation on the case had curdled into obsession. He harassed victims' families, misled interview subjects, stalked people online and off, and routinely promised bombshell revelations that never materialized. When Nelson latched onto the Zodiac Manson conspiracy, he did what he always did. He inflated the claims, repeated them uncritically, presented speculation as fact, and whipped up an audience eager for sensation over documentation. For people outside the research community, Nelson sounded authoritative. He spoke loudly, confidently, constantly. And like many conspiracy theorists, he mistook volume for credibility. Once Nelson began repeating Howard Davis's claim that a Manson man was connected to Zodiac, the theory took on a life of its own. And of all the men orbiting the family story, Bruce Davis made the easiest target, not because the evidence pointed to him, but because it didn't point anywhere else. Bruce Davis was simply a convenient choice if someone wanted to name a Manson family member as the Zodiac Killer. By the late 90s, Davis was one of the few surviving male Manson family members still making news. He appeared in parole hearings, granted occasional interviews, and had published Christian reflections from prison. He was visible, accessible, and alive, unlike many of the men who passed through Spawn Ranch only briefly. Add to that the fact that for a stretch in 1967, long before the Zodiac murders, Bruce hitchhiked around the West Coast. To conspiracy theorists, that detail is irresistible. To anyone familiar with the era, it's banal. Thousands of young men drifted through California that year. But in the hands of people desperate to force a connection, Bruce Davis became a blank screen onto which they could project anything. He traveled. He knew violent people. He lived in California. He later committed serious crimes. To Reddit conspiracy hounds and the like, that was enough. To real researchers, it's nothing. The moment you compare the Zodiac timeline to Bruce Davis's actual movements, the theory folds immediately. Davis was not in Northern California during the Zodiac murders. During most of the canonical attacks between 1968 and 69, he was in Southern California, or traveling to and from London with his Scientology group, or deeply embedded with the Manson family in Los Angeles and Death Valley. There is no credible record placing him anywhere near the Bay Area during any of the confirmed Zodiac events. His physical description also eliminates him outright. While Zodiac witnesses consistently described a stocky man, 5'8" to 10", with a heavy build and thick glasses, Bruce Davis was solid but trim, short, angular, and only about 2 or 3 inches taller than Charles Manson. Bruce was also not known to wear glasses. He looked nothing like the composite sketches. His psychology doesn't match Zodiac's pathology either. Whatever else Davis was, he was not a taunting letter writer, a lone predator of kissing couples, or someone who used elaborate ciphers to flirt with the press. The Zodiac's profile and Bruce Davis's behavioral history are from different planets, and investigators themselves dismissed the theory immediately. No forensic, documentary, or testimonial evidence has ever tied him to the Zodiac killings, and even proponents of the conspiracy acknowledge they have no hard evidence. So why does the rumor live on? Because it's dramatic. It's tempting. It gives amateur sleuths the thrill of discovering a hidden link between two cult status cases. And because certain voices, Howard Davis first, Bill Nelson loudly and repeatedly, kept the rumor alive long enough for it to stick to the edges of the discourse. But repetition isn't evidence, and drama isn't documentation. When you strip away the conspiracy gloss, here's what remains. Bruce Davis is one of the most documented members of the Manson family, with a clear timeline, a clear set of known movements, a well-established criminal record, and decades of parole transcripts, court documents, and interviews that place him exactly where he was when the Zodiac was killing, and it was nowhere near Northern California. He's not a ghost, or a cipher, or a shadowy drifter moving in silence. He's a man whose life has been recorded, interrogated, cataloged, and re examined more times than nearly anyone connected to the Manson story. The idea that he could also be the Zodiac isn't just wrong, it's lazy. It's what happens when people prefer a cinematic twist over the mundane truth. And the mundane truth is this: Bruce Davis is not the Zodiac, and he was never a mystery, only a man unfortunate enough to become a blank canvas for other people's fantasies. Bruce Davis continues to serve his sentence at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. What keeps him in prison is not his behavior behind bars, but his name and its connection to Manson. For many years, he resisted counseling and refused to participate in Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, insisting that his Christian faith alone was sufficient to address his past behavior. By the late 1990s, however, that stance softened. He began cooperating with psychiatric evaluations and entered both AA and NA, if only belatedly, acknowledging that faith and accountability were not mutually exclusive. In 2000, he underwent hip replacement surgery and reported ongoing pain for weeks afterward. After Steve Grogan revealed the location of Donald Shorty Shea's body and was eventually paroled back in the 80s, Davis's legal team pressed the issue of fairness. In 2014, one of his attorneys argued Grogan, the actual killer of Shorty Shea, was paroled 30 years ago because he knew where the body was buried and he could cut a deal. Mr. Davis didn't know where he was buried and couldn't cut that deal. But it's hardly fair and just that he is still in prison while the actual killer has been free for nearly 3 decades. That's not justice. The point was simple. Davis had not been the primary killer of Shea, yet he remained behind bars long after the man who did most of the physical damage was free. The man who did most of the physical damage, Steve Grogan, also had a family connection to law enforcement, which probably got him that deal. Over time, Bruce Davis has tried to articulate remorse, though it came to him slowly. He recalled a conversation with a correction officer who had grown up in Southern California during the murders. As a boy, the officer and his friends were terrified that the Manson family might kill them, until another child reassured them that the killers were only trying to kill the rich people. The officer remembered the odd relief that washed over him at that thought. His family were poor and therefore safe. But hearing that as an adult, Davis said, hit him in a way that nothing else had. He'd thought about grieving parents, about the unnatural horror of burying a child, about the funerals and the wrecked families. But the idea of innocent children lying awake at night, afraid of men like him, deepened his shame. I'm responsible for 9 people in my mind, he later told a parole board. 2 directly, but I supported the cult, the gang, the family, whatever you call it. So whatever they did, I never said no. I never said you ought to stop. Before a 2010 hearing, he described a half-dream in his cell, somewhere between waking and sleep, in which he saw the gravestones of Gary Hinman and Donald Shea side by side. A woman appeared beside him in the dream, a mother figure, who pointed at the headstones and said, "That's all you left me." It was for him a distilled image of what he had taken from the people whose lives unwittingly intersected with his. Davis has been found suitable for parole multiple times by the California Parole Board, meeting the statutory criteria for release. Each time his parole has been reversed at the governor's level, first by Arnold Schwarzenegger, then by Jerry Brown, who cited the gravity of the crimes and the enduring public impact. To this date, He is still not just a murderer, but a Manson murderer. And that label has a weight all its own. At his 2017 hearing, Gary Hinman's cousin Kay spoke against his release. I understand that Mr. Davis is a model prisoner and volunteers in a variety of activities which help his fellow prisoners. Mr. Davis knows the system. It's to his advantage not to cause trouble and to be cooperative. It's good that he contributes to the prison society. Remaining in prison should be his penance for his crimes. Let him continue to contribute by remaining in prison for public safety. Hers was one of many victim impact voices that have shaped the outcome of his hearings. Bruce has family and a limited but real support system on the outside. He was last recommended for parole in 2020, and again, the recommendation did not translate into freedom. Taken together, his life tells a story very different from the myth. For all the conspiratorial fantasies that tried to turn him into something larger, the Zodiac Killer, an unknowable mystery man, Bruce Davis has never been anything but ordinary in the most unsettling way. An ordinary young man, wounded early, both drawn to authority and hostile to it, seduced by a sense of belonging and grievance. An ordinary follower who let someone else's will override his own until he crossed lines he can't uncross. An aging prisoner who now spends his days in a concrete routine, serving a life sentence for crimes committed so long ago that even he struggles to recognize the person he was when he committed them. He is not a phantom or a secret answer to an unsolved case. He is exactly what the record shows, a man whose choices tethered him forever to Charles Manson and whose life has become an extended footnote to other people's stories. In an episode called Mystery Men, he may be the most revealing case of all, not because he's unknowable, but because once you strip away the rumors and the projections, there is no mystery left. There's only a man, a set of terrible decisions half a century ago, and the long, unglamorous shadow they cast over the rest of his life. The late 1960s in California was a time of golden dreams, a time that seemed to promise freedom, love, and possibility. Teen girls in particular embodied the era's carefree spirit, barefoot, wild-haired, and rebellious. It was a time when hitchhiking to the coast or running off to San Francisco felt less like a risk and more like an adventure. But not every girl who fell into the family's orbit was a runaway from across the country or a hitchhiker drifting west. Many were California girls, long before Manson arrived, raised in the sunshine, shaped by surf culture and canyon nights, already steeped in the freedom and looseness of Southern California living. These were the girls who grew up on the edge of Hollywood, who wandered the Venice boardwalk, who thumbed rides up the PCH because everyone did. They weren't running from strict homes or broken families. They were simply living inside a youth culture that told them the world was theirs, that danger was something that happened somewhere else to someone else. And in that innocence, in that uniquely Californian openness, they walked straight into the gathering shadows, not ever realizing how dark things could get. This video explores how the Golden Girls of Manson's family came to define not just the man, but an entire era. How did the bright promise of the 1960s become so synonymous with Manson and evil? And what does their story say about the power of manipulation, the allure of rebellion, and the vulnerability of youth?